introduce you, Justin?
Of course.
Okay, I can do it from here. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear me in the back. So hello, thank you for coming today. Welcome to the Berkeley Center for New Media's Art, Technology, and Culture Colloquium, which is co-sponsored by the Department of Art Practice and the Department of Geography. Hi, Jill. My name is Asma Gazmi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Art Practice. I'm also an executive committee member at the Berkeley Center for New Media, which we call the BCNM. So I just want to let you know we are filming this event, and after Colin Jackson's talk, there will be time for question and answers. So, so everyone will have an opportunity to ask a question. Thank you again for being here. And for those of you who are new to the BCNM, BCNM is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transitions and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological fairness and equity in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. This lecture series was founded in 1997 by Ken Goldberg and is an internationally respected forum for creative ideas. It's free and open to the public, and we invite leading artists, writers, critical thinkers who question assumptions and push boundaries at the forefront of multiple intersecting fields. I want to recognize that BCNM is located on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. Specifically, the Confederated villages of Lishan. The history of prolific technological development in this region has always depended on this land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We are committed to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. I'm so thrilled to introduce Colin Jackson. Jesse is a Canadian artist and a designer based in Southern California. He explores the architecture we construct, from buildings to landscapes to virtual worlds, through objects and images made with digital visualization and fabrication techniques. Originally trained as an architect and engineer, Colin Jackson works across disciplines and has pursued intensive collaborations with urbanists, with designers, humanists, poets, anthropologists, and neuroscientists. Jesse's interactive marching cube performances and installations, which started in 2016 to the present, have been featured in New York, in Los Angeles, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Mexico City, Stockholm, and The Hague. He received the Hellman Fellowship at the University of California, Irvine, and a Howard Wright Fellowship at the University of Toronto. Additionally, he has received project funding from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the National Science Foundation, the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, the Center for Innovation in Information Visualization and Data-Driven Design, and the Digital Media Research and Innovation Institute. Colin Jackson is an associate professor of electronic arts and design at the University of California in Irvine. He also serves as the Associate Dean for Research and Innovation and the Executive Director of the Beale Center for Art and Technology. I'm so glad you're here to learn about Jesse's work. Please help me in welcoming Jesse Colin Jackson.
Thank you, Esma. Thank you, everybody. I apologize. That was the full bio. That was like, struck out that middle paragraph. It is such an honor to come to this series. I mean, this is, as far as I know, the longest standing and most prestigious series in this space that exists. I mean, for 25 years or more. And you've been hosting events by wacky people like me that merge things together in ways that a lot of people don't appreciate. So, and you all appreciate it, so thank you for coming. I have a bazillion slides, which I'll race through, and I'll try to, be less than an hour. I thank you for indulging my title, which is actually in reference to a previous talk I gave to get the job I have at UC Irvine in 2013. And I realized that when we picked the date, that coincidentally, this is the day 10 years ago that I crossed the border to come to America and activated my visa to join the faculty at UC Irvine. I think like a couple of hours ago, 10 years ago. So I thought to myself, when I think about whether the work that I was doing 10 years ago is still pertinent today, like how, so I actually literally got my job talk out and went and looked at the slides to see if I was still doing anything even remotely similar. And I don't know if this is good or bad, but it turned out there were lots of threads that were still alive. At that time I was an architect and trying to get a house built, and that didn't get built. So that's one of the big disappointments of being an architect, is actually never actually building anything. So I was also taking images, these kinds of composite images of, in this case, spaces that repeat in the world. You'll see this technique used throughout the presentation. This one has a great story that I have to tell you, which is the reason I got the job. If you ever do a talk for a job, go and make an artwork that's about the place you're talking about. They really hate this stuff. So I actually hired somebody to drive around and photograph all the Best Buys within a 50-kilometer radius of UC Irvine. I couldn't actually go there, and then send me the files, and then I made this mashup of them all. And I'm pretty sure that's why they gave me the job. I was experimenting with fabrication technology and curating exhibitions in that space. This is one of the first international exhibitions of 3D printed objects. I came from Canada. I was at Oakhead University prior to UC Irvine. And then I was doing some organizing, and the kind of organizing theme will come back at the very end. So in that first talk, I organized it in terms of these tectonic echoes, which I suppose I should explain. Tectonic is simply in reference to architecture in the simplest form. Tecton is a Greek word about the components of architecture. And because I trained as an architect, I can't really escape that formation. But the echo is that I'm not actually making architecture anymore, and so what we see are these kind of vestigial architectural ideas taking place in these objects and images that I make with technology. This slide was in my talk 10 years ago, and this is a project that I hadn't even started yet. In fact, I hadn't been to this place, I realized. And so I was super excited to learn that I was already starting this project, which is actually my most recent completed work. An exhibition, and I have the catalog for here, that just closed in Toronto a couple of months ago. In this time, 10 years ago, I was fascinated by why did we build these things all over the world? This is like I think in my statement here, this is so ubiquitous around the world as to be interchangeable with the city itself. One does not exist without the other. And I'm sure there are exceptions to that, and there are cities that don't have these, but this is one of the most common modern artifacts that we have. Often made of concrete, the high-rise building, and millions of people in the city of Toronto, where I was studying, 1 million out of 3 million people live in a building like this. So I just thought this was really interesting. This is a map of the city of Toronto. They're unexpectedly evenly distributed across the entire city, and they, as I just pointed out, house a tremendous proportion of the city. And as an architect, I just found like how we to some degree imposed this idea on the world. The architects in the period immediately after World War II kind of got together and literally got together in a group and said, let's build as many of these as we can. It's a great solution for housing, and it is a great solution for housing on some level. It provides a tremendous amount of housing very quickly. My question was, what are these like 50 years later? And it was not a judgmental question. I don't think of these as good or bad, they just are, but what the world is faced with now is a bunch of these buildings that are 50 years old, and in a lot of places, including in Toronto, a lot of questions around how do we keep them? You know, and do we keep them, and how do we keep them? They're all kind of falling apart. Buildings last about 50 years before we need to do something, you know, a major renovation is required. I will get to some new media, I promise. We're currently looking at architecture. So the project was a photographic project. These look kind of large format images. They were composite in the sense they're stitched together. I was trying to create images that allowed for the brick texture to coexist with the scale of the building. And in that particular time, I mean, I was either faced with traditional large format film photography or some kind of digitalia. So in this case, this is 50 frames stitched together so you can get right up on the bricks. And one of the consequences of that choice was that I had developed a relationship with the people that were hanging out with me. Like, these kids wanted to know what I was doing, and in fact kind of swarmed me for a while, and we had to have a whole half-hour play session and conversation about like why are you taking pictures of our building, and that was a consequence of the technology, right? Like, I had to stand there for multiple hours to get it all set up and get it registered and get it to work. And so, you know, as a consequence of that choice, it ended up with a different relationship with the building, and also a different image than I might have had with a traditional photographic approach. In an image like this, similarly, not so much kids but deer in the foreground, I'm interested in how these buildings relate to their environments, whatever their environments happen to be. And I'm glossing over a lot of things here because this is not the main subject of my talk, but the point is that there were not just 2 deer. I had to make a choice, a digital choice. How many deer? There were 4 deer, there were 3 deer, there were 2 deer. And so in the final composition, essentially had to just pick how many deer to keep and what was the right answer. So I was just sort of interested in how this choice of photographic technology informed the work in these very specific ways and kind of vexing ways. Like, what's the truth value of photography is called into question instantly in a way that maybe it hadn't been for me previously. These photographs went on to be part of a conversation. I'm very interested in making sure that the work that I do, no matter what it is, isn't kind of art for art's sake exclusively. So as a former architect, I'm kind of, I like to use the word implicated, and I'm complicit in the creation of these buildings. I was trained to make more of them. So there's a movement in Toronto to try to improve and kind of work with the residents of these buildings to make sure that they're vital and remain viable as places to live. Which led me to the Arctic. Please come in, come in. You can't stand at the door and you're going to get invited in. Thank you for coming. I was working with an anthropologist at the time whose field work was in a place called Hay River, Northwest Territories, which, in a coincidence, has been evacuated for the last month because there's been fires all around it, but thankfully has survived the fires. Sits on the shores of Tucho, or the Great Slave Lake, north of the 60th parallel. It has its own problems of representation. You know, when you take pictures in the Arctic, you kind of expect this. This is a picture of the coast, the shore of the lake. But if you took 20 steps back, this is also a picture of the shore of the lake. It's not just this kind of sublime or extreme environment. It's also a place people live and have things like playgrounds that get buried in the snow. So with this question of representation in mind, and with the fact introduced to me by an anthropologist colleague that in Hay River they had one of these buildings that I had taken such a strong interest in, a very curious one that stands alone for no apparent reason. Of course, we could come to learn the reason. And the project proceeded as with the previous one, at least at first. You know, taking pictures of the building and publishing articles about the place and trying to kind of create a new set of conversations about, you know, what's the future of this defining landmark, 50 years old. Also, coincidentally, now evacuated because it had a fire, so it's empty. This led to a show that just closed in in Toronto called Mackenzie Place. I'm going to read now because it keeps me from going on a tangent for a little bit. I spent much of my career as an artist looking at tower apartment buildings, mid-century examples made of reinforced concrete, and the ways in which these structures relate to cities. The buildings, the material, and the urban design philosophy that led to their construction emerged in the early modern period, seemingly without precedent. They've since proliferated beyond our wildest imagination, at this point so ubiquitous around the world as to be interchangeable with the city itself. My Mackenzie Place exhibition examined an exceptional instance of this urban condition, a lone 17-story tower that presides over the center of a small near-Arctic town of Hay River in Canada's Northwest Territories. Far from its expected high-density context, the building is a symbol of both the reach and edge of global capital, settler colonization, and the urban forms these forces engender. Mackenzie Place engages you in what the building sees, how it is seen, and the lives lived within its walls. Officially named Alexander Mackenzie Place after the explorer, but informally known as the High Rise in town, the tower was completed in 1975 to house workers for, this is a bit of Canadiana. In 1975, we were going to build a pipeline from the Arctic Sea down the Mackenzie Valley, which is like, you know, the Mississippi of the Arctic, and connected to the rest of North America. This is ultimately canceled in a very early example of indigenous activism, and, you know, kind of the right thing happened, so we never built this pipeline. But we did build the building that was going to house the workers that were going to build the pipeline. So instead of housing workers, this relic of colonial resource extraction was home to newcomers to Hay River for nearly 50 years, whether indigenous, immigrant, or settler. Anthropologist Lindsay Bell, a former resident of Hay River, introduced me to the town and its tower in 2013, and has linked our careers ever since. We set out to create visual and textual representations that picture the North as heterogeneous, complex, and unfolding, rather than reproducing polarized views of the Arctic as a place of extreme fragility or boundless opportunity. Hay River's tower is visible from nearly everywhere in town and from many kilometers away. It's a visually dominant gravitational anchor that, like the sun, residents learn to avoid gazing at directly, but live their lives in constant reference to. Two large images in the exhibition attempt to reveal the tower as it inhabits the mind's eye. So this is, on the left, 3 Capitol Drive, Hay River, as seen on June 21st, 2015. Northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, northwest, north. Sorry for my Robert Smithson title. Collapses images from multiple positions in space into a representation of one aspect of the town's ambivalent relationship with the building, revolving around it, but never resolving it. The partner artwork, Woodland Drive and Commercial Road, Hay River, as seen on April 22nd, 2013, Nothing Going On, provides another aspect, collapsing images from multiple positions in time into a representation of the building as the feature around which the town's urban life is organized. Then I took a whole bunch of pictures of the building because I was there for 10 years, and every time I was there I had to take new pictures of it because it's visible from everywhere in town. There's a couple of kind of just unique opportunities that turn into fascinations on my part, which is how many different ways can I take a picture of the same thing? This served as both a longitudinal experiment and a meditative exercise, exploring different relationships between the tower and its surroundings, and registering its ever-presence through repetition. In the exhibition, a selection of Bell's raw field notes were arranged above, suggestive of the parallel universe of anthropological inquiry that exists alongside these visual investigations. Okay, now we're going to get to the more properly new media part, because we're still kind of in image making. There's some digital image making for sure, but we're kind of in traditional photographic space. The actual anchor of the project is a film that was made possible through the unique opportunity that the tower's singular presence in town created for generating representation of its surroundings. So typically, towers beget further towers. In this case, the high-rise is the tallest structure within hundreds of kilometers, overlooks the entire town, the adjacent Catlo-Diche First Nation, and the surrounding wilderness. Shot from the roof of the tower and derived from nearly 1 million still images captured over 5 years, the film Mackenzie Place brings to life a panorama of environments and activities across all 4 seasons. To the north, we see institutional infrastructure, such as schools. To the west, industrial areas with the Great Slave Lake visible, well, not visible on this particular still, on the horizon, beyond Canada's northernmost train line. To the south, commercial and residential fabric. And to the east, we see the namesake river and the seemingly limitless boreal forest beyond. Again, poor choice of still. This particular view is fascinating to me because what's not quite visible, I wanted some northern lights for you. I'm not immune to the sublime. I mean, they are wonderful. And essentially, when captured on a camera, happen every single night because, you know, faintly and enhanceable, are trees that lead, if you go directly east, you cross the Hudson's Bay. You essentially have to get to Iceland before another major kind of colonial civilization. There's maybe 1,000 people between here and Iceland, 5,000 kilometers away. The landscape around the building is sometimes beautiful, sometimes banal, inexorably evolving. The film's audio is 4 voices, high-rise residents perhaps, reading aloud from Bell's book, Under Pressure, Diamond Mining and Everyday Life in Northern Canada, which tells the building's story and the stories of those who have made it their home. So Lindsay and I just finished a paper that we co-wrote together talking about this method. It's not a direct collaboration. We both have children, so we call this parallel play. We worked alongside each other for 10 years, doing work that was constantly in conversation with each other, but not necessarily, I'm not going to try to be an anthropologist and she's not going to try to be an artist. Sometimes there's pressure in collaborations to make sure that you do something that exists at the dead center of those 2 disciplines. But for many of us who work this way, there's a real challenge to that. You might make something that is legible to nobody. So we ultimately decided in this project that we would pursue the things that were, that were informed by each other's disciplines, but still legible to the worlds that we were expert in. So she coincidentally released this book this year. So we've done a bunch of co-events together. As befits its conflicted position in the local imaginary, the building is seemingly erased from the town in the film, remaining present only as a shadow. Because Hay River is just below the Arctic Circle, the sundial silhouette of the tower evolves from a single moment of visibility on the winter solstice to a full rotation across all 4 channels on the summer solstice. The film is also a meditation on creative monomania. The original goal, to capture 1 image per minute, per direction for 365 continuous days, proved elusive. I'm going to read that again. I wanted to capture 1 minute per direction, 1 image per minute per direction for 365 continuous days. I read that now and I'm like, also at a distance. I live in California, so all of this equipment has to survive for a year, 4 times, and never fail. And this was a terrible idea. Think it through before you set out to at least test it for a year in your backyard. So what actually happened was I captured images in fits and starts for 5 years, sometimes for months at a time, sometimes 1 camera for many months. Ultimately, all 4 cameras did successfully capture an entire year, but at a completely different frame rate than I wanted them to. A mistake I can't actually explain. And I'm a fairly, it's not in my nature to exploit process work, but I had to in this case. There's sort of no choice. So let me show you, I can really only show you a trailer of the film. Yeah, by the way, this is me. This is the show. This is the film. Here's the trailer.
Hay River's most visible landmark is a 17-story high-rise residential tower the developer named Mackenzie Place. Locals simply call it the high-rise. Mackenzie Place looks like many other North American post-war towers built to deal with urbanization. A concrete rectangle with rows of identical windows and balconies and minimal architectural flourishes. If it were in a city, it would likely not catch your attention.
With everything else around only 1 or 2 stories high, the building looks like it was left here by accident.
His eyes run over the perimeter of the scratched, shellacked, wood-paneled elevator walls.
We then noticed 3 thin dark red streaks on the door close to the bottom. For the rest of that day, everyone will use elevator exchanges to try to piece together what could have happened. Those who sit and smoke at the picnic table out front will get pieces of the story from the property managers, who are out watering their struggling plants. One manager repeats the same joke to each passerby.
23 hours of sunshine. You'd think this shit would grow faster.
It was all about the town's big wheels. You know what I mean? The big wheels wanted it, and they got it.
How can spaces like a transportation community so crucial to national and global economic markets be considered not the real North?
How can a good segment of the working class be considered not the real Hay River?
How can a building that can be seen from anywhere in the community be interpreted as separate from it?
It became clear through countless interviews that these concerns were not interpreted as failures of expedited resource development, but of the building itself.
I received a photo of billows of black smoke coming from the high-rise via text in March of 2019. The high-rise had a massive fire.
All 150 tenants were evacuated.
The local newspaper estimates that over a dozen people, primarily indigenous residents, including some elderly people, have yet to find stable housing.
After the fire, the high-rise was purchased by what a local newspaper described as a sophisticated Western Canadian company. The purchase of the high-rise is the latest iteration of infrastructural prospecting. Past failures become future extractive opportunities for those who can afford them.
The investors told local news that their aim was to help address the region's housing shortage. But just who will be housed in the next iteration of the high-rise is unclear. As of March 2023, no work has been done on the property.
Okay, completely different project now. So that's Mackenzie Place, which did occupy 10 years almost exactly from the original talk. This project has a similar relationship in that, well, first of all, it's going to start from a slide you've already seen. And I'm going to read again because of my own tendency to go off on a tangent like I am now. As I mentioned, one of my long-standing subjects is the type of building endemic to my home city of Toronto, Canada. I'm interested in all of the relationships these buildings have with the environments in which they're located. But I'm going to pivot away from the content of this image towards how it's made. Contemporary digital image is made up of pixels, squares that carry color and brightness values. Pixels are a grid of light-sensitive nodes that, made sufficiently small, can be used to resolve a larger area. We accept this pixel-based understanding of the image blindly, but it's a pretty curious quality. Subdividing the world into a grid in order to understand and represent it is completely unnatural. Nature, even at a microscopic scale, is all about continuity. Bundles of celluloid straws that make up a tree, the interlocking crystals fused together by heat and pressure that make up minerals and rocks. Photographs also used to be continuous, silver halide crystals that, when exposed to light, became the grain in chemical photographs. The grid of pixels we use today is a consequence of our digital age, the inexorable need to make the world reducible to zeros and ones so that it can be digested, transmitted, and stored by a computer. Where did this idea come from conceptually? In order to better understand how we even conceived of putting information in a grid, we need to go back to a pre-digital age. Descartes showed us in the 17th century how space could be represented numerically with a Cartesian coordinate system grid. Jefferson in the 18th century applied this system to the Louisiana Purchase, subdividing the entire area into equal plots of land, sections, quarter sections, and so on, before it was even surveyed. We see the consequences of this decision in every flight over Iowa. In the early 20th century, a proposal was put forward that America should take up the promise of the Jeffersonian grid, and instead of congregating in cities, each family should occupy 1 acre of land evenly spaced. And before you dismiss that as crazy or impossible, the entire population of America could fit into Texas with more than 1 acre for each household. The author of this idea, which you may be familiar with, was Frank Lloyd Wright, America's most famous architect. And as a grad student, I had the opportunity to do a kind of in-depth dive into an architect I actually wasn't that interested in at first, but as a prolific American architect, there's a lot you can see. We narrowed this down to houses that were situated on these 1-acre plots, or at least in his mind. Comparatively modest single-family houses, which came to be known as Usonian homes. So here in the plan for the first Usonian home, we find the grid at a different scale, used to rigidly organize the home into various living spaces. If you know anything about Wright, he was nothing if not a geometric extremist, applying his ideas at every scale and about every axis. The Usonian grid reaches its climax in a series of concrete block projects from the 1950s known as Usonian automatics. They were automatic because they incorporated one additional innovative idea. The blocks were intended to be made on site using local materials, ideally by the homeowners themselves. This part really captured my imagination. Did people really build these blocks themselves? Like, did this actually happen? And it turns out it happened exactly one time. Bill and Elizabeth Tracy took up the challenge and self-produced all 1,700 units required to build their home in the wilds of suburban Seattle in 1956. I had the extremely good fortune of getting to meet Mrs. Tracy and take this image in 2012. At this point, the only thing Mrs. Tracy could tell you about was her house. I mean, she built it herself and had built all the pieces, and had the narrative of the house that she'd given so many times was sort of lodged in her memory, and so she could reliably tell you the house's story. So as shown in this analysis of a different Usonian automatic house in Cincinnati, the units came together in a variety of ways to create the roof and the walls and the various corners. And in fact, it takes 11 different elements to achieve this, each requiring its own mold assembly. These drawings come from Wright's archive. At the archive, I located the instructions for making the molds. And given these, I thought, if Elizabeth Tracy can make her own blocks, why can't I? So skipping ahead to the the hard part, which revealed that none of those drawings were true and nobody actually made the blocks that way, because Wright, at the end of his career, was really not paying that close attention to any of this and would just send the drawings off to people in Seattle. Never saw any of these houses himself. Did ultimately succeed in recreating Wright's pixels for buildings for an installation in which I recreated a representative sample of a full-scale Usonian house. And one of the most interesting, I'm skipping past this again because it's not the most important thing about today. I want to pause here though. One of the most interesting lessons was that the molds that made the blocks are as intriguing as the blocks themselves. They carry all the information required to build the entire building. In a sense, they're the negatives and are used to make as many individual prints as the building needs. Okay, we're still more than 10 years ago. But this backstory carries me right up to the pile of toys you played with, some of you played with earlier today. Let's get caught up. Wright had created a kind of Lego for buildings. This is an actual Wright, you can buy these Frank Lloyd Wright Lego kits, so of course I have all of them. The problem with Lego is that its three-dimensionality is very limited. Like cinder blocks, it stacks only upwards. What would Lego look like if it could be connected in every direction? How would this translate into a component for a full-scale building? We're essentially seeking the holy grail of construction toys, the six-sided connectable object. And this is what I was looking for, and here's the leap to the present, or at least a more recent historical moment. I recognized that the type of system I was seeking, a system that could be used to flexibly construct a building without too many custom parts, had a parallel in another form of grid-like thinking, the computer. The computer is seeking as few custom parts as possible. Better equipped to deal with the same parts over and over again, along with a list of where these parts occur in space. This is how pixels work. The camera stores to memory a list of colored squares and their positions in the grid. The problem with photopixels is that they're crude, like Lego, with jagged stair-step boundaries, and we can get into a whole JPEG artifact conversation about that. But there is, at least in computer graphics, a better way. And I looked to, so rather than look to photographs, I looked to these computer graphics algorithms used to break down areas and volumes that make them comprehensible to a computer. And this is what this looks like in 2 dimensions. I'm going to do like a 5-minute computer science first-year graphics class a bit, although I'm not qualified to actually teach that class. But I've refined this into a nicely worded presentation. The computer takes any arbitrary area, lays a grid on top, and simplifies each component in the grid, resulting in a reasonable simulation of the arbitrary area that's way easier for the computer to manipulate. I was told you wanted weeds. I'm going to take you to the weeds here. Imagine a component of the grid, a single square. Divide that grid further into 4 quadrants. Now, if any part of an arbitrary shape intersects this component of the grid, it gets simplified. Depending on which of the 4 quadrants the arbitrary shape intersects, the computer calculates a different simplification, in this case 6 in total. This algorithm is called marching squares. This is like, again, you could code this in a first-year computer science class and it would generate this for you fairly simply. The computer marches from square to square, computing the necessary simplification for each coordinate in the grid. The same procedure works in 3 dimensions. It's a little harder to represent, but it works in basically the same way. The various intersections of an arbitrary surface with a cubic grid are simplified using a defined computational procedure. And this procedure is called marching cubes, developed to interpret MRI scan data in 1987. When they invented the MRI machine, they didn't actually have a way of turning it into anything useful. They had a point cloud and no way to have the doctors look at it. So very quickly, the folks at GE came up with a computer procedure that would take that point cloud and give it a surface that was then useful. And it was actually slightly more complicated than the surface. For our purposes, if you take all of the possible simplifications and you collect them all together, you end up with a rigorous set of components that can be used to build any volume. It's really only limited by how small you make this cubic grid or the voxels of the grid. So having just finished recreating Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian automatic system, actually, sorry, I skipped over an important part. Let's make one further interpretation. Up until now, I've actually just been telling you about existing ideas. I talked to you about Frank Lloyd Wright's system, I remade it, who knows why. I've showed you the marching cubes algorithm, didn't invent that myself. The novelty comes when we link these ideas together through this interpretation. Unlike in area, a volume has an inside and an outside. It's kind of like each of these things. There's the top and the bottom, and we have to interpret them in a specific way. Having just finished recreating Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian automatic system, this inside-outside relationship was familiar. It was akin to the positive-negative relationship between the blocks and the molds we see here. So why not create a new system of concrete blocks derived from this algorithm? This resulted in a second installation. With some inspiration from Wright, I turned an algorithm into a sculpture. For the first installation, it was important to me that I only use the tools available to Frank Lloyd Wright. So all of the earlier concrete blocks you saw are like handmade, using hand tools and so on, but I never wanted to do that again. So for this installation, it made sense to use contemporary fabrication tools, computer-controlled milling machines to build the molds and also resurface and drill the blocks. And given the fully digitized nature of the project, it was almost inevitable that I would begin making 3D prints from the file, so we're really into like an accelerated trajectory here. I had all this, these files from hours and hours of computer work. Each of the blocks has been modeled to the nth degree, and then, did we remember MakerBot? So it was like a brief moment in history when this was a thing. So I got a MakerBot. It's like, well, what file am I going to print? What's the first thing I'm going to print? Well, I'll just pull a file from that other project and print it, see how it looks. And this got me thinking, because I have gotten tired of making really heavy concrete installations. Also a good lesson to any young artists in the room, don't make really heavy projects early in your career unless you're prepared to store them or throw them away. So I proceeded to make a new set of toy-like blocks with the same shapes as the concrete ones, and here's the very first prototype of this version of it. Here's a bunch of things. These are pins from IKEA that I borrowed from IKEA. You can go to like the parts bin at IKEA and buy them. And I got to a place where all I needed to do was scale up and solve a few additional problems. And now we're at the real project, which has a video. This is Marching Cubes. I'm actually going to show you a slightly different version of the video that's on my website because, just for fun.
Could you turn on closed caption if there are?
Ah, yes, absolutely. This, well, you know what? This video has captions in it, and no only music. Let me pause here and say this is the indulgence is that I'm showing you the proposal to the International Symposium of Electronic Art that they did not accept. But it also has my topology joke in it. So for the geographers in the room. And maybe they didn't like my topology joke. I also have the paper reference if anybody really wants to get it. That's the weedy paper that kind of gets into it technically. But if you're not familiar with the joke, the fact that a mug and a donut are the same thing is the classic joke in topology. They are the same topology. actually. That's kind of this. Okay. Yeah, so there's a paper. And then in the original grant application that funded the majority of this project, I always imagined a user interface. Notice the age of this iPad. That was current at the time. And never really got here, but I did want to show, again, to a new media audience, I want to show you a little bit of one additional video. For reasons that I can't explain, I never record the software that's in the background until this one, which is a fairly recent installation called Final Countdown. I am trying to wind this project down, so I'm giving it titles like Final Countdown. We also played the song Final Countdown repeatedly. We're making Henry Moore sculpture at 5 scales. Not because I love Henry Moore, but because the geometry of the sculpture happens to suit what marching cubes can do. It's got just the right kind of bulbousness and has a hole that's viable. But basically, there's a script running in the 3D modeling software Rhino, and we're turning it on layer. It populates the model with the necessary parts, and then we kind of turn it on layer by layer. I am still working on, making a more friendly user interface for non-expert users. Right now, you need to be able to run Rhino and Grasshopper to make this work. I'll fast, I think, right at the point where my students start eating lunch. It's a good point to. We have Chipotle in here somewhere. Don't need to show you that, but I will show you the end. And even as I tell you that I'm trying to stop making these, I just shipped them all to Nebraska for a show that I'm installing next week. So every time I install something or do a performance, and you notice the two words are being used interchangeably, the performance part is that, but then the thing can be left behind. And that's my fault. Oh, North Korea military. Wow. That's exciting. Oh, I'm glad that happened.
This
That was awesome. And I won't show you the associated video, but what I brought for people to play with if they want, very carefully afterwards. These are the precious version. This is the fanciest, those ones were kind of purples and pinks, and they're relatively crude and they're full of holes from years of use. And these are the most refined 3D printed components. I make all of these in my lab at UC Irvine. They're also really fun to play with, and the project totally makes sense if you actually get to play with it. So I thought I would bring that. Okay, I'm going to do a truncated version of One Last Echo. Suburban Ecologies is in the middle of these two projects. It has no slides from my original job talk, but you'll see some of these, how these themes intersect within this show. This was the show that if you look at the timing of it, you very cleverly coincided with the second COVID wave, thus never opened. And they even extended it. And then in Orange County, we reopened Orange County. I mean, I'm not complaining, this is not the point, but it was just curious how this lined up. March 15th, 2021 was the first day that you could go to art galleries in Orange County. So bit of bad luck. Beautiful show, nobody saw it. So I want to show it to people at least in slide form. And in this case, I'm just going to kind of race through some of the elements. There is a video. The video is kind of repetitive if I show it and then show you the slides, so I'll skip past the video, but it's on my website. And I'll just kind of walk you through the 6 elements. This project merges my interest in fabrication technology with the fact that I had moved to Orange County, which is where I live now, from Canada, and wanted to take advantage when I first got there of, like, what do you call this, the fresh eyes of a newcomer. And Orange County is a strange place. I mean, it has some positive qualities, but it's not Toronto or Berkeley, for that matter. But it does have beaches, and so in the prettiest project, and in some ways, I don't like the beach, so I forced myself to go to the beach. In fact, forced myself to walk the entire length of the 6 beach cities of Orange County and create these composite images that try to bring some of the complexity of these sites. I work with ecologists at UC Irvine who point out that these types of beaches in urban areas are almost completely devoid of their natural creatures. Like all the walking on the beach and the beach shoes strips them of all of the things that make a beach, which is really curious. And got me wanting to somehow represent that. So each of the 6 images is the collapse of the length of these 6 municipalities that constitute the beach side of Orange County. They're very simple. Pick a bunch of spots that seem like they capture some characteristic that belongs in the final image, narrow them down a bit because you can't include all of them, and then take a panoramic image standing in the water. So this is organized around standing as close as I can to where the water is crossing the bottom of the tripod. So I'm sort of standing right there, and make a 360-degree panorama of the image. It's also, like, admittedly, Orange County is pretty nice. These are the beaches near where I live. Some of them busy, some of them kind of tidal, some of them not. Some of them with these, some of them rocky, some of them surrounded by houses, always full of people, and then collapse them into one thing. And actually, you can tell this is sort of COVID because we have people in masks everywhere, which is so interestingly, this becomes a bit of a nostalgic, or not nostalgic, but reminds me of the COVID times, more extreme COVID times than now. Okay, and then facing those in a pretty specific way, some of the more recent Marching Cubes projects, I realized they make topography as opposed to topology really well. This is the Santa Ana River watershed. This is the major water system that runs through the dead center of Orange County. Here it is, the Santa Ana River. You've all heard of the LA River because it's in LA, and this is a much better river. It's bigger, it's even more interrupted. We moved the mouth of the river from here to here in 1908, and then put a huge dam here, and it's a perfect case study in interrupting an ecological system with human intervention. It's also used to have the largest floods west of the Mississippi. Like, this is a massive floodplain, which is why it's so controlled. So despite its short length, it has a really large flow because the tallest point in Southern California is here at 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 11,000 feet. So we've got all of these snowy mountains flowing into this very short river. So this is the landform, vertically exaggerated as things need to be to resolve, even when they're tall, and then turned into a Marching Cubes assembly that looks like this. Opposite these are projected films that represent a cross-section of this landform moving from sea level to summit and back again. That warrants a little bit more explanation. This is a series of films. They're actually related to the Mackenzie Place films. I finally thought I should probably test some of these methods in a smaller scale, and they're each an hour long. There's 10 of them, so they're a structural film. You're not really expected to watch 10 hours of them. But what they do is, over the course of the journey, here's the journey from the water's edge to the high point and back again, they trace that landscape and then move from fully pixelated to fully unpixelated states. So this is the transit, and this is what's along the way. We have a fully paved over river, Southern California style. We have the tent cities along the river. We have the California Aqueduct crossing the Santa Ana River, which is one of the wilder western moments in the world. So all the water from Los Angeles is not from the Santa Ana River. It all comes from Colorado, and here's where they cross. And then up into the mountains and into the snow. And this is the sort of high point of Southern California. And so each frame is processed across all 10 films in a few different states, ranging from clearly an image to clearly pixelated. And then at some point cross over into the kind of ambiguous, like, would you know what that was if you were faced with it? And then by the time you get to here, you're left with a kind of color field that is clearly not interpretable, representationally. And so the two films played opposite each other in the space. And then there's a soundtrack that is processed in the same way. In the smaller room, we have recurring housing units collapsed in images. So of course, you move to Southern California and you are in the world of tract housing. And in fact, UC Irvine is located in the largest master plan community in the world. World famous if you like master plan communities. And there are qualities about them that I enjoy. I mean, and they're certainly interesting to unpack. And the way that I unpacked them was, well, here we have some sculptures made of things you see on the table and also things that you saw earlier. So this was a chance to do a kind of mashup of the two generations of marching cubes. But more importantly, a series of prints where I locate the organizing feature of the tract housing complex in question. Not always the house. In this case, it's like a circular parking garage assembly that's organized around this brick planter and then collapse them into one image. So just like the previous collapses, I'm trying to find a photographic way of representing place that is perhaps a little more accurate to how it was imposed onto the landscape than an individual photograph might be. So here you see like renovations being added to some of them, or you know, in this case, the houses actually resolve pretty well. This is 8 houses on top of each other. Interestingly, people who live in these houses never care that I'm taking pictures of their houses. They come up and talk to me. I offer to bring them artwork and give them a copy, and they never want one. Never, in my experience, has anyone ever wanted the artwork that is derived from these projects, despite having to commune with their house for like a full hour to make it work. So taken together, the work expresses the commonalities and contradictions of Orange County's overlapping ecologies, and I have just enough time for a bonus project. You can see a transition towards questions of ecology a little more directly. They're always present, but I mean, increasingly, like many of us, I'm interested in climate change and some of the ecological questions that surround it. And I'm the executive director of the Beale Center for Art and Technology, a really curious counterpart to your center in the sense that you have this wonderful public program, but we have a physical space. So I propose that we merge these things somehow, because we don't have, our public programming is okay, but we're lucky enough to have a brick and mortar or brick and stucco facility that I encourage you all to come to. We have fabulous shows like Computational Poetics and Difference Machines, that some people in the room have seen, that we took from AKG Buffalo. And I just snuck this in for Olivia, who's here in the room. This is Olivia's show, opening September 30th. Experiments in Art, Access, and Technology, bringing together 5 artists working at the intersection of disability and technology through a program at Leonardo called the Cryptech Incubator. One of my projects personally at the Beale Center is to start to interrogate, we're 25 years old as well, and you know, is the art and technology lens exclusively sufficient? And I do think it is, but there are these other relationships, not just today, but historically, of course. If you go stretch back to the Whole Earth Catalog or any number of other references, you get back to a time when questions of technology and ecology were pretty interlocked, and you know, we're in conversation with each other. So I'm rebooting that conversation within our facility with some events and some exhibitions with our students, and but most interestingly, and where I want to leave you, because I think it might be an opportunity for some of you in the room if we once we get there, is this is my campus. There's the Beale Center. This is the School of the Arts. UCI's a ring. Also a great conversation. We just imposed a ring right across an arroyo. This is Orange County. Keeps moving out Southern California. And if we zoom back into Yucca Valley near Joshua Tree National Park, we get to one of UCI's Natural Reserve System facilities. You have Natural Reserve System facilities as well. All the UC campuses do. This one's called Burns Pinion, and it's in the transition zone between the Mojave and the Colorado deserts at about 5,500 feet, where the Joshua trees end and the pine forest begins. And this only happens at universities, folks. I discovered one day that we had a building just in the desert near Joshua Tree that nobody used, just kind of, not abandoned exactly, but essentially, actually it was full of junk. So a grad student and I ran a class where we just kind of asked ourselves, well, what could we do in this art space and at the intersection of art and ecology out in the desert? Here we are, here's what it looked like. We emptied it out. It's a beautiful, in my mind, the architect in me is like, this is a beautiful mid-century modern building. How are we not? What are we doing here? So we trucked all the 25 years of debris and filled a dumpster and some asbestos that I probably shouldn't have pulled out myself, and tried to make it into at least a usable space as our first move, and we've started using it for student events. Here's some paper making workshops with undergrads. And there's a long way to go. We're just on the brink of, we're not trying to turn it back into a building exactly, but into an enclosure. And we are going to put some glass back in the windows and turn it into a space that in the long run, I'm trying to make available for kind of across the system and artists in the community that are interested in questions of art and ecology, and and could do work, either workshops or have exhibitions in the space. So if you're interested in that, write me and I'll keep you on the mailing list. And that is me 10 years later. Thank you. Should we finish the North Korea video? I mean, it's really, oh yeah, there we are too. I would be happy to answer questions. I would also invite you all to come up and gently play with the marching cubes if you'd like to, because they are really fun. Maybe the questions first, because they're really loud. If there are any. Yes?
So maybe it's because I'm a cartographer, but I have grid ennui.
Oh yeah.
And so I was looking at the kinds of shapes that you're making, and the sort of the shift from something that is circular, like pi, to the quadratic equation feels kind of brutal. Like something is lost. And I find the same when you've sort of got these images of the coastlines, and again, classic geographer, I'm always thinking of Mandelbrot's work on fractals and the coastline. And again, to have it sort of just a bunch of angles as opposed to something that is infinitely long. Like,
well, so I hear you on
Yeah.
me, absolutely. Except for the fact that that's how digital technology works. So my pushback would only be that we don't have a kind of fractal version of digital life. It is this intensely, the ennui is justified because we're a little bit trapped. And yes, we have the promise of quantum computing and other things, but I mean the backbone of the force that we unleashed on the world in the digital age was to take everything and make it digital in a really brutal way. Which isn't to say that, like the criticism of the projects themselves notwithstanding, I guess I resist the shift towards something more kind of appealing because it's not grid-like. Because it kind of ignores the fact that the rest of the technological universe is still we're still in the process of converting all analog things, which have that beauty in them, into things that are just sort of stupid, because they become zeros and ones, and they become pixels or voxels. There isn't really, and with regards to the ocean images, I mean, that's where I think, I'm not quite sure what you mean by the angles, like the angles of how they sit on top of each other, or the...
I was thinking about,
Oh, the one where the turn in squares.
the river and how it becomes this kind of...
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's the first version of that project, and the idea there was to start off with the brutal, like the kind of most brutal processing of the image, and one that in that show was meant to be in conversation with the marching cubes. So there, I do think there's an opportunity to not adopt, like I could just as easily process them in another way, and I do have some plans to start doing that in evolutions of that project, where this transit of space, and then how to kind of turn that into a film using these structural techniques. So I totally agree with you there. I don't want to make more pixelated projects. They also seem a little bit anachronistic. Like we've seen pixelated artwork before, but in the context of that particular show, I was just trying to maintain this really strong relationship between the pixelated object, and in some ways, because the ecology was almost meant to be provocative by interpreting the ecology in exactly the way that nobody wants it to be interpreted. But thank you for the criticism.
It wasn't criticism, it's a question.
Or question. No, I mean like I
But I think like the fundamental question is that you know, so we have these versions of mathematics prior to Descartes that are in different places that are very much about problem solving, about building, often about architecture. Everything gets systematized into a universal grid that has to be singular. Everything has to conform to it. And I often wonder what happens to pi, to curves, that, you know, yes, they are expressed as equations, but actually, like, does computing have to be that way?
I mean, we have our golden mean projects. I mean, yes. So like that's where I'm in complete agreement that that's not necessarily the most interesting mathematics. In that case, I'm trying to describe to people, and maybe this is the wrong audience for sort of getting back to like where does this come from and why are we so grid? Why do we have grid on me? Why, you know, well, because we went grid crazy for multiple generations, for hundreds of years. We started to ignore previous mathematics and just latched onto this thing. And I don't think it's an overstatement to want to reflect on the degree to which the digitization of things kind of forces that issue, because it's just how digitization works. We may well be, I would defer to computer scientists in the room and how they're able to, because in some sense it's not about the mathematics, because there's beauty there. It's about how this very narrow branch of mathematics that is very, like, once we get into things like the quantum nature of some of the communication technologies, the mathematics gets more interesting even in our phones. But in some of the sort of image making and storage and making it all work on YouTube, it's all this sort of brute force methods to simplify and make it as computationally efficient as possible through digitization. So I'm essentially trying to bring that stuff back into the conversation with some of this work. Maybe with subjects that are not the obvious choices of subject.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I'm curious, I'm just thinking about how sometimes architects and anthropologists even can sort of be very removed from the thing that they're studying, whether it's people or objects or whatever. So I'm curious in looking at, and maybe this is something that your collaborator did maybe more directly, but in looking at, the high-rise, there's also a community in the high-rise. And so I'm wondering where the community voice is.
Yeah.
Or maybe you could speak to that.
Absolutely. That's a problem for anthropologists and artists and so many scientists. And anthropology as a field has grappled with this for 100 years as it kind of realized the damage it had done by being these kind of outside observers, almost indifferent to the subject. The project, so because I can't show you the whole film, the audio of the project there's a lot of interaction on the ground with the residents in the building, and not in a way that, like, we're not saving people in the building, we're not saving the building. The building is in fact now evacuated. It's empty through an event that postdates this project, but the whole project hinged on working with people in the building, and then in the case of the book project that is the audio for the film, the majority of it is not unpacking, is kind of direct, the informants are directly expressed in the film and in the book. Interestingly, the book project, and actually they're here if you want to see them. I mean, this kind of sounds like, now the fact that we have their voices in the project doesn't necessarily mean it's not extractive. You're essentially asking the extractive question, like, what does the community get out of this? And I don't know that I can promise that, does the community need a film about their building? Maybe not. I'm prepared to accept that this project could not exist, but I'm also kind of comfortable and happy with the fact that the community has always been interested and supportive of the project in various ways. One of the curiosities of this particular building in this particular town is that everybody lives in it at some point. That can't be completely true, but if you move to Hay River, it's the place that has vacancy. the Arctic in Alaska and in Canada is like a very low vacancy situation. It's really hard to find housing. And so we picked a subject, somewhat inadvertently in my case, because I connected to Lindsay's fieldwork after the fieldwork happened, that had a really, like, the tentacles of the building and its stories stretched across kind of all different communities within the town. And so within both the film and the project, we see different people's stories and different ways of relating to the building. And the thing that was almost universal in town was the way in which people would deflect attention from the building, which is what we're sort of expressing in some of the prints. There was a almost, you know, again, I hate to use words like universal, but a really common characteristic where when you started talking to people about the building, they're like, oh no, don't talk about that. Like, that's not us. Like, that's not what we're about. We're about these other things. And then you'd circle back to it. It's like, well, you know, try to unpack that a bit with people. So I guess to finish my answer, like, I think the project is very challengeable on the extractive front, like any project that engaged with the community. But there was a tremendous amount of community engagement. The next showing of the project is we have a community partner there that runs the college there, you know, the college in town that's a branch college of this pan-Arctic Canadian college system is the next venue for the show. And one of the questions we had with them was like, you know, do people want this? Like, is this like, you know, am I just like bringing artwork that they don't want to see? But I have to say, I've had kind of like dozens of experiences now where people from Hay River have been able to see the show in Toronto, and the reaction is uniformly enthusiastic. It's like there's an excitement about the fact that you've turned this thing in my town into an artwork, and like I never would have thought of that as a thing to do, and so there's a lot of excitement about coming up to Hay River and showing it. This actually introduces a whole new art challenge, which is, of course, like in a gallery you've got walls and equipment and stuff, and so we're making a traveling version of the exhibition that can be installed in the gymnasium. They don't have a gallery in Hay River. They're going to have some walls somewhere, but trying to make sure that it doesn't like, to make sure that the immersive experience of the film isn't somehow reduced because of the facilities, if that makes sense. Does that answer?
Yeah, I didn't think, I think there's like a lot, I'm going to dinner, we'll talk about it at dinner. But I would say it's interesting that I would imagine there are people that grew up in the building that now can't access it also because of the fire, so the interest might actually be even greater now for people to see. It's
definitely different, right? And even some of the coincidences, you know, where I can think of. I spent 5 years traveling back and forth to Hay River to maintain the equipment and kind of work with. And the project also evolved over time, I should say. Like any project, there were other projects on the ground. The film project became the final thing, but originally we were doing a completely other set of projects. And the way that you'd access the building was the caretaker I'd hand the caretaker $50, he'd give me the key, because that was the system. And then I'd go take the key to the roof and then go on the roof and give him, you know, we'd trade it back. And as soon as the fire happened, I wouldn't have been able to even get the project would have died. There was only like a 3-month difference. Like I went up in November 2018, took all the stuff down, and then in March 2019, the fire happened, and now the building's empty. And can't access it. Now, it wouldn't have been so sad that I lost my cameras. I mean, these people lost their homes, but I agree. Like, I don't know that part, because the film isn't about the building on fire. Beyond like a 10-second mention at the end of the audio is a thing I'm very curious about, because it's become a bit of a memory for people now. And it's not clear that the building won't be torn down. It's literally too big to tear down, in a way. It would take millions of dollars and no one would spend it. So it's going to be there no matter what. But it's not clear that anybody will succeed in renovating it, because it's also so expensive to do that, essentially. There's not enough incentive financially for the owner, sadly, and not enough government subsidy interest currently to do the work that's necessary to make it habitable again. So yeah, all of which to say, those questions are front of mind when when bringing it back to the community. But I feel that given the enthusiasm from all parties on the ground, and I feel a commitment to do that, even if the reaction is mixed, because it seems like it was promised.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of going back to what Jill was saying, when I was seeing that building, I was thinking less about the specificity of it and, thinking about similar buildings I've lived in Karachi, Pakistan, or in other parts of the world. And so I'm wondering if there's something that you're trying to do, not just in that specific work, but across the various projects that you've shown us, where there's a way in which specificity or the object sort of stands in for a lot of, like, perhaps the way the pixel functions, where it can be a lot of different things based on the context that it's being seen in. And I wonder if, I feel like there's that productive tension in your work where it's certainly about one thing, but it's also about a kind of abstraction of that thing to make it connect with all of these other things.
I think you've teased out a question I'm afraid of in a good way, because I anticipate the question, what is the relationship between marching cubes and the building? It's in some ways, and the answer, for a while I didn't know it myself. Like, as an artist, you make work because you make work, and certainly it is interrogated and it changes under interrogation, but you're compelled to make what you want to make. And at some point, somebody pointed out that you're just about modularity. You're about the to be more provocative about it, I think it's a bit of, I'm interested in the modularity fetish of modernity. The building and the systems and digitalia are all this version of, like, we need to make a system that we can then, like, scale. Like, and the tech industry is this incarnate, right? Like, everything has to scale. And the buildings, in some ways, are an early example of this hyper-scaled system that they're very similar worldwide. I mean, I could get into the weeds of just how similar, like, a fly-form concrete 8-foot ceiling building is between Karachi and Toronto. I mean, they're different in certain respects, but they really did come up with a system that could be used to house people, at an enormous scale, and we needed that. But now we have them, and, like, a quarter of the world lives in buildings that are, somewhat akin to this Hay River building. The Hay River example is just so particular. It became specific there because of its exceptional circumstance. But and actually, to go back briefly to an earlier question, I am cautious of I'm very interested in the stories of people who live in all of these buildings and always have been, but I do deliberately not focus on the stories in my work, not because I don't think that work's worth doing, mostly because there are others doing that work. There's lots of work about people's lives within structures, and I'm in conversation with that, and often, I won't go back to the slide, but in the earlier slides of, like, the building in Toronto, it's notable that the people are, if not invisible, are very small. And that's meant to kind of make people angry in some respects. A certain group of people is like, well, I don't care about that, I care about the people in the building. It's like, well, we need to take a look at the structure that brought them together. And if we, so it's a choice. There's a very deliberateness to that it is a bit cold in certain respects. Like, what does seem to happen, though, is that the stories of people in those buildings kind of come out in the conversation around the project, and that's the part that I enjoy. One more.
How do you, I guess, maybe resolve a tension, I think maybe I'm feeling, between the modularity and the fixity, let's say, like the fixity of molds that create an infinite number of things, or the fixity of the points where you're taking photographs, with the concept of ecology? How are you threading these things together? Because when I think of ecology, it's rhizomatic, and it's full of, the smaller things that maybe you can't quite see, And I'm just sort of wondering how you're using the concept of ecology in your work.
I'm laughing because I have a series of marching cubes assemblies called Rhizomatic number 1 and Rhizomatic number 2 that I won't show you. Am I resolving that tension? Probably not yet. Although it strikes me as a kind of dinner conversation of sorts. I'm not sure that the binary of, kind of, what do I want to call it, Cartesian and non-Cartesian space is necessarily productive all the time. Like, I do think the tension you described is one of the core tensions of our age, right? It's like we spent the 20th century invested in modularizing and systematizing and digitizing everything, and are now faced with various crises that are a consequence of those choices, including, and in some ways, like the building projects are more critical. This project is just taking the idea to an extreme and is not necessarily critical of it at all. Like, and that I'll acknowledge. Like, this is a fun toy that is really satisfying to build things with, and doesn't necessarily ask any hard questions about whether it's a good idea to make yet another system. So probably Nana could answer the question, but like, I feel the tension, but what I don't want to do in my own work is leave these forces that trained me, that I'm clearly, like, my mind is wired for, and kind of drop them in favor of a more kind of automatically rhizomatic set of geometries or way of thinking, and maybe find a way to resolve those things. I think the pictures, the collapsing landscapes are beginning to do that. Not the one with that become pixelated, but the ones that are the still images, where we sort of get away from the picture as a representation of place into something more complicated. There I'm trying to, using the layering to layer together all of the different kind of forms of occupation and the complexity of the space and the conflicted nature of those spaces. Might be the closest I'm coming to that.
The mold seems to be like a consistent theme, though, throughout all these works. I mean, I don't know. For me, that's what I'm looking at. That the mold is the thing that caught my attention when you were making these cubes, and then the mold is sort of like the building, right? Because that is the thing that is organizing the space, at least for you, when you're taking these photos.
Yeah, like it had, exactly right. Okay, so exactly. Like there's a certain point of view that gets established, and then you're stuck with that mold. Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering what your working concept of ecology was. That was like the base question.
Working concept of ecology. I mean, it's funny how ecology is a system, and these are systems, but we do think of ecological systems as kind of infinitely more complex. I think that's a great question, and I want to do it justice. But one of the things when I'm talking more, this was not a particularly ecology-heavy project because you're the media center, so in more ecology versions of these conversations, I'm beginning to be interested in ecological legibility. I talked with ecologists about the fact that we walk around in our landscapes and can't read them the way that an ecologist can. And I find that that's becoming a really important starting point for, I think, a new series of projects I'm not showing, which may not resolve the tension, but are trying to use this ecological question so what an ecologist would be like, when I'm standing out in a garden, this just looks like a jumble of letters. When I'm out in a natural landscape, they make words and sentences, and they actually come together as a system. And maybe as an attempt at an answer, it's like we have our ability to unpack these kinds of systems is very strong. We've spent hundreds of years, even teaching kids, right? There's a whole conversation about historic pedagogical tools like Freuble blocks embedded in this project and different toys that kids use. And it was really important for a few generations now to teach kids to think in Cartesian geometric terms. It would be amazing to kind of come up with, well, what are the pedagogical strategies that would undo, the thing that made me into the thing I am, and the monster that wants to deploy this, more of this in the world, because it's yeah, it's like embedded in the way that we teach people. Break things down into systems and parts. Yes.
Thank you. My question has a lot to do with this, and not calling you a monster.
I call me a monster.
Not calling you a monster, but thinking about that tension between deploying a system that you yourself has created crisis, and the word violence wasn't used, but in a way of limiting or reducing a curve into something that it isn't, just so it becomes legible, which you said as well. And then creating these objects that are so beautiful, because the pieces you make are beautiful, the images are beautiful. There's an aesthetic pleasure in this otherwise thing that we shouldn't be enjoying. So just that kind of ethical question between aestheticizing damage perhaps, or as a creator is interesting. I don't know what you think about this. Like, if you're a monster, why are you making us enjoy these monstrosities, right? Should we not enjoy them?
I mean,
I'm not calling you.
No. I mean, so I talk about complicity in the architecture projects, because in some ways those projects were about me, and still are about me, kind of trying to undo that training. Not because I dislike architecture. I'm deeply formed by it, and but I do find the sort of like narcissism and the way that not just architects, I don't mean like just architects, but the people who design the things in our world kind of impose them on us without really, not really thinking about anything other than geometric purity. I mean, look at this room, right? I mean, like all rooms, right? Every academic room in every building, everywhere is I'm not going to overdo the grid, but it's a grid of squares. Like, this doesn't have to be, although it makes it cheap and easy to deploy. Like, you can see the reasons why they do this, and it seems so. I do have this enduring fascination with how divorced all of this is from that which might bring us pleasure. So maybe by bridging that gap, by like taking the systems of the world and trying to bring them closer to a pleasure center. But I don't think I don't feel guilty about that. Like, I'm not concerned that I'm just further propagating the violence of modernity on the world. I mean, I think that's I can't take that. I can't take on that burden, and I don't know that. Well, I could take on that burden, but I think, and there isn't, and this is where the projects do start to diverge. Like, the degree to which Marching Cubes does not have an activist quality to it. It's actually getting closer and closer to kind of product space in a sense. I mean, it is a fun toy. Like, I do think everybody should play with it. And then the pleasure starts to take over, and we're maybe not as worried about its violence. And I don't think it's necessarily violent either. Right? But I like the idea. I mean, I've never contemplated the potential violence of it too. So that's exciting. No, absolutely. I think, and I also think, like any art, like anyone who makes things, you're sort of working through your own pain. So I do think there's. Look, no, I mean, I don't mean. I say that, I laugh too, but I do think a lot of these projects are just about a deep sort of subconscious sense of like, these things are violent. So I think your choice of words is not wrong. There's a kind of like, and to take the system and make it so big, and when you have all the parts and you're working on it with people, it's like, it takes over your mind. I mean, it's not just whether it's violent or not, it's definitely all consuming, and people leave it like, and they're all their thing. I don't know if any of you 3D model or do anything or play any of these games, and like, when you leave those games, you have dreams about what happens in those games, right? So they're very, very like synaptic or something, and so that part of it is certainly disturbing to me, but I wanted to play it out because it's where my head was at and where it went. I feel like we're like keeping people for dinner. I'm happy to answer more questions. Love to talk about myself and my work, like anybody.
I think it's a good time to wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming. And do we have any
future events to
Yeah, we've got plenty of future events. Check us out at ECNN's website, ecnn.berkeley.edu. We've got another event next Monday evening, another art, tech, and culture colloquium. So all the information's there. Eduardo Costa, visual artist coming from Argentina, next week is going to be presenting, and plenty more throughout the rest of the fall semester and spring as well. So thank you all for making it.
And thank you so much for coming. So,
Thanks, Jess.
thank you for coming. Yeah.
This is Alexa.
Hello.
Teresa is in the TID meeting, MDes student, was ArcGIS.
Okay.
I helped out with submarine today. And I may have slightly like, don't think about PHP because that website's closed. Maria's going to regret volunteering for that. Welcome to the Chaos Merchant Society. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, we've got that. So yes, there's another one. I said basically, give us a kind of okay. But none of them is after October 20th. Okay, no problem. Where we're going is when oh, some people
Oh, yay.
I'm trying to find things. You were just great. I don't know. Okay, so I wanted to make sure you guys know Alexis is basically.
Well, so there is, so like from the interaction.
Okay. Okay, great.